On February 19, 1971, two teenage hitchhikers walking along the State Road 470 bridge near Lake Panasoffkee in Sumter County, Florida, noticed something unusual floating near the shore. When they looked closer, they realized it was a human body submerged in the shallow water, held down by a heavy metal object. They ran to alert the authorities. Responding deputies from the Sumter County Sheriff's Office retrieved the remains and determined immediately that the victim was a young woman. She had been strangled using a man's size 36 belt that was still fastened tightly around her neck. With no identification on her, no personal items nearby, and no immediate missing person match, the investigation began with more questions than answers. The victim was a white woman estimated to be between 17 and 24 years old. She had long brown hair, stood approximately 5 feet tall, and weighed around 110 to 120 pounds. Her clothing included a green shirt, green plaid slacks, and a green poncho. She wore a thin yellow gold necklace and a silver ring on her left hand. The medical examiner determined she had died 2 to 3 weeks before being discovered, and her cause of death was strangulation. There was no evidence she had been submerged for long periods, suggesting she had been placed in the water shortly after death. Investigators searched the lake area for additional clues. The body had been anchored using a heavy metal auto part tied around her waist. No purse or wallet was located. Detectives interviewed local residents, businesses, and travelers who frequented the Lake Panasoffkee area, a region known in the early 1972 for its transient traffic along U.S. Highway 301. No one recognized the victim. With no leads, she was buried in a local cemetery under the name Jane Doe, and later known publicly as Little Miss Lake Panasoffkee. In the decades that followed, the case remained open but unsolved. In 1986, skeletal remains were exhumed for further forensic analysis. A new autopsy revealed evidence of past injuries that had healed years before her death, including signs of childhood illness and a prior ankle injury. Investigators also noted distinctive dental characteristics, including dental work consistent with European techniques. This prompted speculation that the woman may not have been from the United States. In the early 2000s, forensic anthropologists re-examined the remains and used new tools to create a more accurate facial reconstruction. They also performed an isotope analysis on samples from her bones and teeth. The findings suggested she had grown up in southern Europe, most likely in Greece. This conclusion was later reinforced when investigators consulted experts who identified that her jewelry and clothing style could be consistent with European origin. The isotopic signatures from her teeth indicated she had spent her early childhood in a Mediterranean region. Despite this significant information, investigators were unable to link her to any missing person reports from Europe or the United States. In 2012, the case was reopened again with advanced forensic technology. A new facial reconstruction was created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the case received renewed national attention. For the first time, investigators felt hopeful that someone might recognize her. Several tips were received, suggesting she might have been a tourist, a migrant worker, or an immigrant who had entered the United States shortly before her death. Although these leads were carefully reviewed, none produced a definitive match. In 2020, investigators exhumed the remains again to collect DNA, suitable for modern sequencing. Forensic genealogy had already solved numerous decades-old cold cases, and the Sumter County Sheriff's Office hoped the same technique would finally reveal the identity of the woman found in the lake nearly 50 years earlier. A specialized laboratory succeeded in developing a DNA profile despite the age and condition of the remains. The profile was uploaded to genealogical databases used for investigative purposes. Over the next several years, forensic genealogists constructed a family tree using distant DNA relatives. The results pointed toward Irish ancestry, combined with roots in the northeastern United States. These findings contradicted the earlier hypothesis that she was from Greece, suggesting instead that previous isotopic interpretations may have reflected dietary patterns rather than geographic origin. Genealogical mapping eventually narrowed the search to a small number of families living in Massachusetts during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. In early 2025, the investigation reached a breakthrough. DNA linked the unidentified woman to the Rowan family of Lowell, Massachusetts. Investigators contacted surviving relatives and requested DNA samples for confirmation. After comparison, the Sumter County Sheriff's Office announced the positive identification. Little Miss Lake Panisofsky was Maureen Louise Rowan, born in 1954. She had been missing for more than 50 years. Maureen Rowan grew up in Massachusetts in a large family. She was one of several children and attended local schools in Lowell. According to family records, she struggled during her late teenage years and eventually left home. Relatives lost track of her in the early 1970s. She had not been officially reported missing because the family believed she had chosen to separate from them and possibly relocate out of state. At the time, runaway cases among young adults were common, and missing person procedures were not the same as they are today. No formal report existed linking her name to law enforcement databases. The revelation that she had been the unidentified woman found in Lake Panisofsky brought closure to her family, but also opened new questions for investigators. The circumstances of her final days remain largely unknown. Detectives believe Maureen may have been traveling through Florida or living temporarily in the region. The location where she was found near major highway routes connecting central Florida to the southeastern United States suggests she may have been picked up while hitchhiking or staying in a transient area. The belt used in her strangulation was a common men's size, offering little forensic specificity. The lack of personal items left at the scene hindered efforts to reconstruct her movements. Investigators reviewed old witness reports from the early 1970s. Some individuals had reported seeing a young woman matching her description in the weeks before she was found. Others recalled unfamiliar vehicles parking near the lake. These accounts, however, had remained unconfirmed and vague for decades. Even with the identification now confirmed, detectives emphasized that solving the murder itself remains a separate and ongoing challenge. The Sumter County Sheriff's Office stated that the identification of Maureen Rowan reopens investigative pathways. Detectives are now reconstructing her known travel patterns, social contacts, and possible employment during the months before her death. They are also examining individuals who lived in or frequently traveled through Sumter County in 1971. While the passage of time complicates interviews and evidence recovery, investigators noted that cold cases solved by genetic genealogy have often led to additional discoveries, even decades after the initial crime. Maureen's surviving relatives expressed gratitude for the identification, acknowledging that although the revelation brings sadness, it provides long-awaited truth. For law enforcement, the identification represents a significant milestone in a case that spanned 5 decades, multiple exhumations, and successive advancements in forensic science. From isotope testing to digital reconstructions to genealogical DNA mapping, each stage contributed a piece of information that ultimately led to her name being restored. The name Little Miss Lake Panisofsky, once a placeholder for a victim without identity, has now been replaced by the full identity of Maureen Louise Rowan, a woman whose life began in Massachusetts and ended under violent circumstances far from home. With her identity confirmed, investigators continue to focus on the most important remaining question: who killed her and why? On May 6, 1988, investigators from the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office were called to a wooded area off River Road in rural Virginia after a man walking his dog discovered human remains. The site was secluded, surrounded by overgrown brush and tall trees. When deputies arrived, they confirmed the remains were skeletal and had been exposed to the elements for months or possibly years. With no identification found nearby, no clothing able to be traced, and no immediate matches to missing person reports, the case began as an unidentified homicide. The remains belonged to an adult male. Because the body was heavily decomposed, investigators could only determine an approximate age range, likely between 30 and 50 years old. A forensic pathologist noted signs of trauma, suggesting foul play. The exact cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains, but investigators classified the case as homicide based on the evidence available. Detectives searched the surrounding area for clues. No wallet, ID, or personal belongings were found. No vehicle was located nearby. Nothing at the scene offered a clear indication of who the man was or how he had arrived there. Investigators canvassed the region, asking residents if they had noticed suspicious activity during the months prior. But the wooded area was isolated, making it unlikely anyone had witnessed the killing or the placement of the body. Forensics teams gathered bone samples, dental records, and any remaining trace evidence. The remains were compared to missing persons cases from Spotsylvania County and surrounding jurisdictions. Dozens of possible matches were considered. None were confirmed. With no identity, investigators referred to the man only as John Doe and classified the case under an unidentified homicide file. Throughout the late 1982nd, and early 1992nd, detectives revisited the case periodically. They rechecked missing persons reports as they came in, searched national databases, and compared the dental characteristics with entries from across Virginia and neighboring states. But without DNA technology as it exists today, the ability to match the remains to a missing individual was extremely limited. By the mid-1992nd, the case had grown cold. In the early 2000s, as DNA technology advanced, investigators attempted to extract a DNA profile from the skeletal remains. The profile that was generated was incomplete and unsuitable for national database comparison. Still, the renewed interest brought the case back into review. Detectives looked again at missing persons entries from the late 1982nd, but continued to find no match. In 2022, the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office partnered with a private forensic laboratory specializing in degraded DNA extraction and forensic genealogy. Technicians succeeded in generating a usable DNA profile from the remains far more detailed than what had been possible 20 years earlier. The profile was uploaded to genealogical databases used in criminal investigations. Forensic genealogists began constructing a family tree based on distant DNA relatives. Over time, the genetic connections narrowed to a group of families concentrated in Virginia and West Virginia. The genealogists worked backward through generations, identifying shared ancestors and determining which family branches were most likely connected to the unidentified man. In early 2024, the genetic evidence pointed toward the Wilmer family of West Virginia. Detectives contacted surviving family members and requested voluntary DNA samples. The comparison confirmed a familial relationship to one individual, Allen William Wilmer Sr., born in 1946. Additional genealogical markers matched Allen with near certainty. The Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office officially announced that the unidentified remains discovered in 1988 had been positively identified as for one-year-old Allen W. Wilmer Sr. With the victim finally identified, investigators turned toward reconstructing his life and disappearance. Allen Wilmer had lived in both Virginia and West Virginia during his adult years. Records showed he had worked various jobs and had family connections in the region. His relatives told investigators that Allen had last been seen alive in the late 1982nd. At the time, the family believed he had relocated or was living transiently, and they did not file an official missing persons report. Because of this lack of a formal report, Allen's name never entered national missing person systems, leaving no reference for investigators in 1988 to compare against. The absence of that record was a significant factor in why the case remained unsolved for decades. With the identity confirmed, investigators began reviewing Allen's known associations. They examined his last known residences, employment history, and acquaintances from that period. Because Allen had not been seen by family for years before the discovery of the remains, detectives focused on the possibility that he had encountered violence shortly before he disappeared from contact. Cold case detectives re-examined the original 1,988 crime scene photographs and investigative materials. They reviewed evidence for details that might connect Allen to individuals known to law enforcement during that time. They also explored leads involving people who lived near River Road or were familiar with the wooded location where the body was found. Records from the late 1982nd were analyzed for reports of suspicious individuals, undocumented vehicles, or violent incidents in Spotsylvania County and surrounding regions. Although the identification marked a major breakthrough, no immediate suspects were identified. Detectives interviewed surviving relatives to gather information about Alan's lifestyle and personal relationships during the years before he vanished. They also contacted people who had known him during his employment in Virginia and West Virginia to reconstruct his movements before his death. The sheriff's office noted that the confirmation of Alan's identity reopened investigative pathways that had not been available in the late 1980s. For the first time, detectives had the ability to examine Alan's history, associations, and possible conflicts. They also possessed a narrowed time frame of when he was last seen and where he likely traveled before his death. The investigation continues with renewed focus. Detectives are now attempting to determine who Alan may have encountered near the time of his disappearance. They are analyzing archival law enforcement records for individuals living near the crime scene area during the late 1980s who were known for violent behavior. They are also encouraging the public to come forward with any information, no matter how old, regarding Alan's last known whereabouts. The identification of Alan Wilmer came nearly 36 years after his body was found. For his family, the announcement brought answers that had remained unknown for decades. For investigators, it marked a turning point in a case that had remained stagnant since the initial discovery. The sheriff's office emphasized that the case is now active, with the homicide investigation focusing on reconstructing the final period of Alan's life and identifying individuals connected to him during that time. The remains that were once labeled only as John Doe in a cold case file now carry a name: Alan William Wilmer, Sr., a man whose death in the late 1980s is finally acknowledged and whose case is being actively pursued. Identifying him has provided direction to an investigation that once seemed impossible to solve. While the person responsible for his death remains unknown, the restoration of his identity represents a critical step towards solving the 1988 homicide that left him unidentified for more than 3 decades.